They were cast out by their own children in the dead of winter, told they were worthless burdens who had nothing left to give. But when Marlowe and Delphine took refuge in a forgotten mountain cabin, they discovered a stone vault holding $275 million, and the cruel children who abandoned them would soon come crawling back. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind rattled the windows of the small craftsman house on Sycamore Street, carrying with it the first real bite of November cold. Inside, Marlowe Hendricks moved through the kitchen with the careful deliberation of a man whose 72 years had taught him to measure his steps. His hands, gnarled from 5 decades of carpentry work, gripped the edge of the counter as he steadied himself. The arthritis had been worse lately, especially in the mornings, but he never complained. Complaining was for people who had someone to listen. Delphine, his wife of 48 years, stood at the stove stirring a pot of soup. At 69, she still moved with a quiet grace, though her shoulders had begun to round and her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. She wore a cardigan Marlowe had bought her 10 Christmases ago, the elbows worn thin, the color faded from burgundy to something closer to rust. They didn't have money for new sweaters. They barely had money for heat. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing, like cinnamon and false hope. It was Thanksgiving, and their 3 children were coming for dinner. Sutton, their oldest at 46, worked in real estate development somewhere in Phoenix. Thaddeus, 43, managed a car dealership in Tucson, and Lennox, the youngest at 39, sold insurance and lived 2 towns over, but might as well have been on another planet for how often they saw her. Marlowe had spent the entire morning cleaning, dusting picture frames that held images of smiling children who no longer smiled when they looked at him. Delphine had cooked for 2 days straight, stretching their grocery budget until it screamed, determined to show her children that she could still provide, that she was still useful, that she still mattered. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock. Punctual, cold, transactional. Marlowe opened the door to find Sutton standing on the porch in a wool coat that probably cost more than Marlowe's truck. His hair was slicked back with product, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Behind him stood Thaddeus, thick around the middle and perpetually annoyed, and Lennox, thin as a rail and checking her phone like it might self-destruct if she looked away. No one said Happy Thanksgiving, no one hugged. They filed in like auditors, like inspectors, scanning the worn furniture and peeling wallpaper with barely concealed disgust. Marlowe watched his children remove their coats with the care of people trying not to touch something contaminated. His chest tightened, but he forced a smile. Dinner was tense from the first bite. Delphine had set the table with their wedding china, the set her mother had given them, plates so old the gold trim had worn away to ghosts. She served the turkey with shaking hands, desperate for approval, for acknowledgement, for anything that felt like love. Sutton cut into his meat and chewed methodically. "This is dry," he said, not looking up. Delphine flinched. "I'm sorry. I can get you some gravy." Lennox pushed stuffing around her plate. "Why is it so cold in here? Are you not running the heat?" Marlowe cleared his throat. "We keep it at 62. Saves on the bill." 62? Thaddeus laughed once, sharp and mean. "Jesus, Dad, you're living like squatters in your own house." "We're managing just fine," Marlowe said quietly. The table fell silent except for the scrape of forks on plates. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the old window frames. Inside, the temperature seemed to drop even further. It was Sutton who finally broke the silence. He set down his fork with deliberate precision and folded his hands. "We need to talk about your situation." Marlowe looked at Delphine. She had gone pale. "Our situation?" "This house," Sutton gestured around the room. "This life. It's not sustainable. You're both getting older. Medical bills are only going to increase. You can barely afford utilities." "We're doing okay," Delphine whispered. "No," Lennox cut in. You're not. We've seen the notices, the late payments, the debt. Marlowe's jaw tightened. How would you know about that? Because the hospital called me, Lennox snapped. I'm listed as your emergency contact, remember? They said you missed 2 payments on Dad's knee surgery. The room seemed to shrink. Marlowe felt heat crawl up his neck, shame and anger mixing into something bitter. We're working it out with them. By working it out, you mean ignoring their calls, Thaddeus said. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Look, we didn't come here to fight. We came here with a solution. Marlowe didn't like the sound of that word. Solution. It always meant someone else deciding what was best for you. Sutton pulled out his phone and opened a document. We found a very nice assisted living facility about 40 minutes from here. It's clean, affordable. They have medical staff on site 24/7. Delphine's soup spoon clattered against her bowl. Assisted living? It's the smart move, Sutton continued, his voice taking on that practiced, condescending tone he used to close real estate deals. You sell this house, use the equity to cover the facility costs, and we stop worrying about you freezing to death or falling down the stairs. Marlowe's hands clenched into fists under the table. We're not selling our house. Dad, be reasonable, Lennox said, finally looking up from her phone. This place is falling apart. The roof leaks, the foundation is cracked. You're sitting on a property that's barely worth the land it's on, and you're drowning in bills you can't pay. We built this house, Delphine said, her voice breaking. We raised you here. Every room has a memory. Memories don't keep you warm, Thaddeus said flatly. Memories don't pay for medicine. Sutton leaned forward, his expression almost kind, which made it worse. Mum, Dad, we love you. That's why we're doing this. You need care. You need support. And honestly, he paused, glancing at his siblings, we need to start thinking about our futures too. There it was. The truth, naked and ugly, sitting right there on the table next to the dry turkey and cold stuffing. Your futures? Marlowe's voice was barely above a whisper. We all have expenses, Sutton said, defensive now. Kids in college, mortgages, investments that didn't pan out. The money from this house, it could help all of us. You'd be taken care of, and we'd finally have some breathing room. Delphine stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. You want your inheritance now? The word hung in the air like smoke. That's not, Lennox started, but her voice trailed off because they all knew it was exactly that. Marlowe stood too, his 72-year-old body trembling with something he hadn't felt in decades. Rage, pure, righteous rage. Get out. Sutton blinked. What? Get out of my house, Marlowe repeated, louder this time. His voice cracked but held. All of you, get out. Dad, you're being dramatic, Thaddeus said, not moving. We gave you everything, Delphine said, tears streaming down her face now. We worked 2 jobs each to put you through school. We went without so you could have. We loved you with everything we had. And this is what we get? You want to warehouse us so you can split up our home like vultures? That's not fair, Lennox said, standing. You're making us sound like monsters. Then stop acting like them, Marlowe shot back. The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then Sutton stood, straightening his expensive coat. Fine, he said coldly. But when you can't afford your medication, when the power gets shut off, when you fall and there's no one to help you, don't call us. We tried to help. You refused. He walked to the door, his siblings following. At the threshold, he turned back. One more thing. We're done. Done visiting. Done bailing you out. Done pretending this works. You want to be stubborn? Be stubborn alone. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Marlowe and Delphine stood in their dining room, surrounded by half-eaten food and the wreckage of their family, holding each other as the wind outside howled and the house settled into a cold, aching silence. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in bed, Marlowe's arm around Delphine's shoulders, both staring at the ceiling as shadows played across the cracked plaster. Delphine cried quietly, her body shaking with sobs she tried to suppress. Marlowe didn't cry. He couldn't. The grief was too big, too heavy. It sat on his chest like a stone. "How did we fail them?" Delphine whispered into the darkness. "We didn't," Marlowe said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We must have. Children don't just turn cruel for no reason." Marlowe didn't have an answer for that. He thought back to the years of Little League games and dance recitals, of birthday parties and graduations, of scraped knees he'd bandaged and nightmares he'd chased away. Where had it gone wrong? When had his children stopped seeing him as their father and started seeing him as an obstacle, an inconvenience, a burden to be managed? The wind rattled the windows again, and somewhere in the house, water dripped from a leak they couldn't afford to fix. The heating system clanked and groaned, struggling to keep the temperature above 60. Marlowe thought about the hospital bills stacked on his desk, the notices from the mortgage company, the credit card statements he'd stopped opening because looking at them made his chest hurt. Maybe the kids were right. Maybe they were being stubborn. Maybe assisted living was the practical choice. But God, he didn't want to leave this house. This house where he'd carried Delphine over the threshold 48 years ago, where they'd brought home 3 babies wrapped in hospital blankets, where he'd taught Sutton to ride a bike in the driveway and helped Thaddeus build a treehouse in the backyard, where Delphine had painted the kitchen yellow because she said it made mornings happier. This house was their life, their proof that they'd built something real, something lasting. Except it wasn't lasting, was it? It was crumbling. And so were they. 3 weeks passed. Thanksgiving came and went, leaving a scar that wouldn't heal. The phone never rang. No one called to apologize or check in or even argue further. The silence was absolute, and somehow that was worse than the cruelty. At least cruelty acknowledged you existed. December arrived with heavy snow and heavier hearts. Marlowe spent his days in the garage tinkering with tools he no longer had projects for, avoiding the empty house. Delphine cleaned obsessively, scrubbing floors that were already clean, organizing closets that were already organized, moving through the rituals of homemaking, even though there was no home left to make. They were ghosts, haunting their own lives. One afternoon, Marlowe was going through boxes in the basement, looking for nothing in particular, when he found an old accordion folder stuffed with papers. Tax returns from the 1980s. Birth certificates. His and Delphine's wedding license. And underneath it all, a manila envelope he didn't recognize. He opened it carefully, the paper brittle with age. Inside was a property deed, dated 1976. His breath caught. The deed was for a piece of land in the Bridger Mountains, Montana, 30 acres and a cabin, deeded to him by his uncle Silas, who died nearly 50 years ago. Marlowe had forgotten about it completely. He'd never even seen the place. Uncle Silas had been a strange man, a hermit who'd moved to Montana in the 1950s and never came back. When he died, he'd left the property to Marlowe with a simple note, "It's not much, but it's yours if you ever need it." Marlowe had been 23 then, newly married, with a baby on the way and a good job. He hadn't needed a cabin in the middle of nowhere. He'd filed the deed away and forgotten about it. Until now. He climbed the basement stairs slowly, his knees protesting with each step. He found Delphine in the kitchen, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard. She looked smaller somehow, like grief had compressed her. "Del," he said softly, "I found something." She turned, her eyes red-rimmed and tired. "What is it?" He held up the deed. "Remember my Uncle Silas?" She frowned, thinking. "The one who lived in Montana?" Marlowe nodded. "He left me property, a cabin and some land. I'd completely forgotten about it." Delphine took the paper, studying it. "Why are you showing me this now?" Marlowe was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "What if we left?" She looked up sharply. Left this house, this town, this life that's killing us. What if we just packed up and went to Montana? Started over. Delphine stared at him like he'd suggested they fly to the moon. Marlowe, we're almost 70 years old. We can't just start over. Why not? What's keeping us here? Our kids don't want us. We can't afford the bills. Every day in this house is a reminder of what we lost. He stepped closer, taking her hands. Maybe Uncle Silas left us an escape route, and we just didn't know it until now. Tears welled in Delphine's eyes again. What if the cabin is falling apart? What if there's nothing there? Then we'll fix it, Marlowe said. That's what we do. We fix things. He squeezed her hands. Or we'll freeze to death trying, but at least we'll do it together, on our own terms, not warehoused in some facility where we're just waiting to die. Delphine looked down at the deed, then back at Marlowe. When her eyes met his, he saw something he hadn't seen in weeks. A spark, a flicker of the woman he'd fallen in love with 50 years ago, the one who'd married him with only $27 between them and said, "We'll figure it out." "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, let's go." They spent the next week preparing in secret, moving with the quiet determination of people who'd made an irrevocable decision. Marlowe sold his truck to a neighbor for $3,000 cash, far less than it was worth, but speed mattered more than value. Delphine packed only what they could fit in their old Ford pickup, the one that barely ran but had been paid off since 2008. Clothing, some kitchenware, photo albums they couldn't bear to leave behind. Marlowe's toolbox, heavy and scarred from decades of use. Delphine's sewing machine, the one her mother had given her as a wedding present. They left everything else. The furniture, the wedding china, the television that barely worked anyway. It was just stuff, and stuff had never made them happy. They didn't tell anyone they were leaving. There was no one to tell. On a grey December morning, as frost painted the windows and their breath misted in the frigid air of their unheated house, Marlowe and Delphine Hendricks walked out the front door for the last time. They didn't lock it. They just left the keys on the kitchen counter next to a note for the bank that said, "It's yours now." The truck's engine coughed to life, reluctant in the cold. Marlowe gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and Delphine sat beside him, her purse in her lap, staring straight ahead. Neither of them looked back at the house as they pulled away from Sycamore Street. They drove north through Colorado, then Wyoming, watching the landscape transform from familiar to foreign. The mountains grew taller, sharper, their peaks white against grey skies. Towns became smaller, farther apart, until they were driving through stretches of wilderness that seemed untouched by civilization. Delphine didn't speak much. She watched the scenery pass, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally wiping tears she pretended weren't falling. Marlowe drove steadily, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks at truck stops where waitresses called them honey and sweetheart and never asked questions. They spent the first night in a cheap motel in Casper, Wyoming. The rooms smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but the bed was warm and they had each other. Delphine fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from emotion and travel. Marlowe lay awake, listening to her breathe, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. But when morning came and she smiled at him over terrible diner coffee, he knew they'd made the only choice they could. The second day of driving took them deeper into Montana. The towns grew even smaller, the spaces between them wider. They passed through places with names like Prey and Emigrant, towns that looked like they'd been forgotten by time itself. The road narrowed, becoming a 2-lane highway, then a county road, then gravel. According to the deed, the property was off Forest Service Road 47, 23 miles past the town of Cook City. Marlowe had an old paper map spread across the dashboard, the kind that gas stations used to give away for free. Delphine traced their route with her finger, squinting at the tiny print. "It should be coming up soon," she said. Marlowe slowed the truck, scanning the roadside for markers. The landscape here was breathtaking and terrifying. Mountains rose on all sides, their slopes thick with pine and Douglas fir. Snow covered everything, deep and pristine, glittering in the weak afternoon sun. They hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. There, Delphine pointed. A weathered wooden sign, half buried in a snowdrift, marked a narrow turnoff. The letters were faded, but still legible. Hendrick's property, private road. Marlowe turned the truck onto what could barely be called a road. It was more of a path. 2 ruts in the snow where some previous vehicle had driven, maybe months or even years ago. The truck bounced and slid, its engine whining as he navigated around rocks and fallen branches. They drove like this for another 30 minutes, climbing steadily into the mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Delphine gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. "Marlowe," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Maybe we should turn back." He didn't answer because he wasn't sure they could turn back. The path was too narrow, the snow too deep. They were committed now. And then, through the veil of falling snow, they saw it. The cabin sat on a small plateau carved into the mountainside, backed against a wall of stone and surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Marlowe had expected, built from river rock and timber, 2 stories tall with a steep roof designed to shed snow. The windows were dark like closed eyes, and the whole structure had the look of something that had been asleep for a very long time. Marlowe stopped the truck about 50 yards away, the engine idling roughly. They both stared in silence. "It's real," Delphine whispered. It was real. But it was also forbidding. The cabin looked solid enough, but isolated beyond anything they'd ever experienced. No other structures were visible in any direction. No power lines, no telephone poles, nothing but mountains and trees and sky. "Well," Marlowe said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something like fear. "We're here." He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of falling snow and the distant call of a raven. They climbed out of the truck slowly, their bodies stiff from 2 days of driving. The cold hit them like a physical force, sharp and merciless. Marlowe guessed it was somewhere around 10 degrees, maybe colder. They approached the cabin together, their boots crunching through snow that came up to their ankles. The front door was heavy wood, iron-banded, with a simple lock. Marlowe pulled the key from his pocket, the one that had been in the envelope with the deed. His hands were shaking, from cold or nerves or both. The key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn at first. Frozen, probably, Marlowe worked it back and forth gently, the way he'd learned as a carpenter, patient and persistent. Finally, something gave. The lock clicked. He turned the handle and pushed. The door swung inward with a groan of old hinges. Cold, stale air rolled out to meet them. Marlowe stepped inside first, Delphine close behind him. The interior was dark, lit only by the grey light filtering through dusty windows. As their eyes adjusted, they began to make out details. The main room was large and open, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that rose from floor to ceiling. Furniture sat covered in sheets, ghostly and still. To the left was a kitchen area with an old cast-iron stove and a hand pump sink. To the right, a wooden staircase led to a loft above. The walls were lined with shelves and hooks, everything neat and organized, as if someone had carefully prepared the space before walking away. "It's been empty a long time," Delphine said softly, her breath visible in the frigid air. Marlowe moved through the space slowly, testing floorboards, checking walls. The structure seemed sound, no obvious leaks or damage. Uncle Silas had built well. In the kitchen, Marlowe found the pump and worked the handle. After a few resistant strokes, water gushed out, icy cold but clear. "Well, we've got water," he said. Delphine had pulled back one of the sheets covering a sofa. Underneath, the furniture was old but intact, upholstered in a faded floral pattern that probably hadn't been in style since the 1960s. She sat down carefully, testing it. The springs creaked but held. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at her husband. Marlowe looked around the cabin, at the cobwebs in the corners and the dust on every surface, at the cold stone fireplace that hadn't held a fire in who knows how many years. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and the afternoon was fading into an early mountain dusk. "Now," he said, setting his jaw with determination, "we survive." He went back out to the truck and began unloading their supplies. Delphine found a closet near the kitchen stocked with old blankets, musty but serviceable. While Marlowe brought in their belongings, she shook out the blankets and draped them over the furniture. Behind the cabin, Marlowe discovered a covered woodshed. Thank God! It was stocked with split logs, seasoned and dry, protected from the elements. Uncle Silas had clearly believed in being prepared. Marlowe loaded his arms with wood and carried it inside, making multiple trips until he had a good stack beside the fireplace. Darkness fell fast in the mountains. By the time Marlowe knelt in front of the fireplace, the cabin was almost completely dark. His fingers were numb as he arranged kindling and newspaper, striking match after match that guttered out in the draft. Delphine knelt beside him, holding a flashlight they'd brought from the truck. On the 7th match, the kindling caught. A small flame licked at the paper, then spread to the twigs. Marlowe carefully added larger pieces, coaxing the fire to life. Slowly, painfully slowly, the flames grew stronger. He added a log, then another, and finally the fireplace roared to life with a heat they felt immediately. Delphine let out a sob of relief. The warmth spread through the main room, pushing back the killing cold. They pulled the sofa closer to the fire and huddled together under every blanket they had, watching the flames dance. Outside, the blizzard intensified. Wind howled around the cabin, driving snow against the windows. The temperature plummeted. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, creating a small sphere of light and warmth in the endless mountain darkness. "Do you think they've noticed we're gone?" Delphine asked quietly. Marlowe knew she meant their children. He doubted it. Probably not. She was quiet for a long time. "Then, do you think we'll survive this?" Marlowe pulled her closer, feeling her body trembling against his. He thought about the nearly $3,000 they had left, the food supplies that would run out, the harsh winter that was just beginning, the isolation so complete that if something went wrong, no one would even know. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd rather freeze here with you than slowly die in that house alone, waiting for children who stopped loving us." Delphine tilted her head up to look at him, the firelight making her eyes shine. "They still love us. They just forgot how." "Maybe," Marlowe said. "Or maybe people just become who they really are when you stop being useful to them. That's a sad way to see the world. It's an honest way." They fell silent again, both lost in their own thoughts, their own grief. The fire burned lower, and Marlowe added another log. Outside, the storm raged. But inside, in that small circle of warmth, Marlowe and Delphine Hendricks held each other and made a silent promise. They would endure this. Together, one day at a time, for as long as they could. Because what else was there? What happens next will turn this frozen exile into an impossible discovery, reveal a fortune that had been waiting in silence for decades, and remind us why sometimes the people who have nothing left to lose are the ones who find everything. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The first real morning in the cabin arrived with pale, weak sunlight filtering through ice-crusted windows. Marlowe woke before Delphine, his back aching from sleeping on the old sofa, his breath misting in the cold air. The fire had died overnight, leaving only ash and a lingering smell of smoke. He carefully extracted himself from the tangle of blankets and Delphine's sleeping form. His joints protested every movement. 72 years of living, of working, of simply existing sat heavy in his bones. But he stood, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and approached the fireplace. The morning ritual began. Paper, kindling, patience. His hands remembered the motions even if they moved slower now, even if they shook from cold and age. The fire caught on the third match this time. Progress. As warmth began to spread through the room again, Marlowe explored the cabin more thoroughly. In daylight, he could see details he'd missed the night before. The craftsmanship of the place was remarkable. Every joint was tight, every board carefully placed. Uncle Silas might have been a hermit, but he'd been a skilled one. In the kitchen, Marlowe found the old cast-iron stove and figured out how to light it. More wood, more fire, but this one for cooking. The heat it generated was intense and welcome. He found a dented coffee pot in one of the cabinets and made coffee using their supplies, water from the pump, and grounds they'd brought from their old life. The smell woke Delphine. She sat up slowly, her silver hair wild around her face, looking confused for a moment before memory returned. "Oh," she said softly, "we're really here." "We're really here," Marlowe confirmed, bringing her a cup of coffee. They spent that first full day learning the cabin. Delphine discovered the root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. Stone steps led down into a space that stayed cool year-round, and stocked on rough shelves were dozens of mason jars, preserved vegetables, fruits, even some meat. The dates on the lids ranged from the late 1970s to early 1980s. "These are still good," Delphine said, examining a jar of green beans by lantern light. "Properly canned, they could last 50 years. It was a treasure. Between these supplies and what they'd brought, they might actually make it through the winter. Marlowe checked the rest of the structure, testing the roof access, examining the stone chimney, exploring the loft that held a simple bed frame and more storage. Everything showed signs of age, but nothing of neglect. Uncle Silas had maintained this place right up until he couldn't anymore. That afternoon, as Marlowe was carrying more wood from the shed, he heard an engine. He froze, listening. The sound grew louder, something approaching on the snowed-in road. His first instinct was fear. Had someone tracked them here? Had the children somehow found them? But the vehicle that emerged from the trees was an old Jeep, battered and mud-splattered, with chains on its tires. It stopped near their truck, and a woman climbed out. She was somewhere in her 60s, Marlowe guessed, wearing canvas work pants and a thick wool coat. Her grey hair was pulled back in a braid, and her face was weathered in the way of people who spent most of their life outdoors. She walked toward the cabin with the confident stride of someone who belonged in these mountains. Marlowe met her at the door, uncertain. "You must be the Hendricks folks," she said without preamble. Her voice was rough, but not unkind. "I'm Birdie. I live about 5 miles that way," she pointed vaguely northeast. "Saw smoke from your chimney yesterday. Figured I'd better check if you were squatters or the actual owners." "We're the actual owners," Marlowe said. "I inherited the place from my uncle, Silas Hendricks." Birdie's expression softened slightly. "Silas. Good man. Strange but good. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd help you if you needed it." She looked past Marlowe into the cabin. "You folks planning to stay through winter?" "That's the idea." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You know what you're getting into? Winter up here isn't like winter in the valley. We're talking months of isolation, temperatures that'll freeze exposed skin in minutes, storms that'll bury you so deep you won't see your truck till April." "We'll manage," Marlowe said, though even he could hear the doubt in his voice. Birdie snorted. "Sure you will." She walked back to her Jeep and returned with a box. "Supplies," she said. "Spare batteries, some canned goods, fire starters, medical kit. Call it a welcome to the neighborhood gift." Delphine had appeared in the doorway. "That's very kind of you." Birdie shrugged. "Up here, we take care of each other because nobody else will. You need anything, you come find me. I'll draw you a map. But understand, I can't always get out in bad weather." Sometimes you'll be on your own for weeks at a time. She spent the next hour with them, pointing out important things. How to read the weather by the clouds. Where the best hunting spots were if they got desperate. How to tell if the ice on the creek was thick enough to walk on. She was brusque, practical, but there was genuine care beneath the roughness. As she was leaving, she paused at her jeep. One more thing. Your Uncle Silas. There were always rumors about him. People in town thought he was crazy, paranoid. Said he talked about conspiracies, about protecting something valuable. Protecting what? Marlowe asked. Birdie shrugged. Nobody knew. He never said, but folks whispered he might have had money, might have been hiding something up here. Course, folks whisper a lot of things in small towns. Most of it's horse shit. She climbed into her jeep, then looked back one more time. But sometimes it isn't. She drove away, leaving Marlowe and Delphine standing in the snow, watching until the sound of her engine faded completely. That's unsettling, Delphine said. Marlowe nodded, but he filed the information away, another mystery in a place full of them. The days began to blur into a rhythm. Wake with the sun, build the fires, melt snow for extra water, ration food carefully. Marlowe spent hours each day maintaining the cabin, fixing small things, preparing for the deeper cold he knew was coming. Delphine organized their supplies, cooked simple meals, and tried to make the place feel like a home rather than a shelter. They didn't talk much about their children. The wound was too fresh, too deep. But sometimes at night, sitting by the fire, one of them would remember something. A birthday party, a school play, a moment of joy from when the family had been whole. They'd share the memory quietly, carefully, like handling something fragile. Then they'd sit in silence, mourning what was lost. 3 weeks into their mountain exile, Marlowe was exploring the perimeter of their property. The snow was deep, but he'd fashioned rough snowshoes from materials he found in the shed. He wanted to understand the land, to know what they had. The property was larger than he'd realized, stretching back into the mountain. He found old trails, mostly overgrown but still visible under the snow. One led to a natural spring, still flowing despite the cold. Another wound through stands of pine so thick they blocked out most of the light. On one of these explorations, Marlowe found something odd. Behind the cabin, built against the mountain itself, was a stone structure he'd initially taken for a retaining wall. But examining it more closely, he realized it was more than that. The stones were carefully fitted, mortared together with obvious skill. It looked almost like the foundation of something, but there was no building above it. He ran his hand along the stones, his carpenter's eye noting the precision of the work. And then his fingers found something, a groove, a seam so fine he almost missed it. His heart began to beat faster. He traced the seam, following it up, across, down. It formed a rectangle, a door. Marlowe looked around as if someone might be watching, then studied the stone door more carefully. There was no obvious handle, but near the center, almost invisible in the mortar, was a small hole, a keyhole. He stood there for a long time staring at it, mind racing. Uncle Silas, paranoid Uncle Silas who'd lived alone in the mountains for 40 years, who people whispered about, who'd left cryptic warnings. What had he been protecting? Marlowe didn't mention the discovery to Delphine that night. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he needed to process it himself first. Maybe because he was afraid of what it might mean. But 3 days later, during a rare moment of warm afternoon sun, he told her. They stood together in front of the stone wall, and he showed her the seam, the keyhole. "Do you think there's a key?" she asked. "If there is," Marlowe said, "it would be in the cabin somewhere." They searched systematically, carefully. Every drawer, every shelf, every trunk and box they could find. Nothing. Days passed. They began to think maybe the keyhole was just a remnant of something Uncle Silas had planned, but never completed. Then Delphine found the locked metal box in the attic. It was tucked behind a beam covered in dust and cobwebs, small, made of steel, with a combination lock that had seized with age and rust. Marlowe brought it downstairs, and they stared at it. "We could break it open," he said, "or we could figure out the combination," Delphine countered. They tried birthdays, anniversaries, every significant date they could think of related to Uncle Silas. Nothing worked. Frustrated, Marlowe finally took a hammer and chisel and carefully worked at the lock mechanism until it gave way with a crack. Inside was a leather journal, yellowed papers, and a single iron key. Marlowe's hands trembled as he lifted the key. It was old, hand-forged, heavy, the kind of key that opened something important. Delphine opened the journal. The pages were covered in tight, slanted handwriting. Uncle Silas's writing. She began to read aloud, random entries. March 7th, 1978. Moved the last of it today. Backaches. But it's safe now. They'll never find it here. June 19th, 1980. Heard trucks on the road. Stayed hidden. They were looking. They'll always be looking. But I'll die before I tell them where it is. December 25th, 1982. Alone again for Christmas. Maybe that's how it should be. Some burdens aren't meant to be shared. The entries went on, cryptic, paranoid, but consistent in one theme. Uncle Silas had hidden something valuable, something people wanted. The last entry was dated April 2nd, 1992. Getting old, getting tired. Doc says my heart won't last much longer. Good, I'm ready. The collection is complete. 34 pieces. 275 million by the last estimate. Maybe more now. It's all documented, all real, all mine. Earned, not stolen, no matter what they said. Whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, know that I could have sold it all and lived like a king. But I didn't trust the world not to destroy it, not to turn it into just more money-changing hands. So I buried it. I hid it, and I'll die with it. Unless you're reading this. In which case, it's yours now. Do with it what you will. But be careful. Some people will kill for this. Some already have. Delphine and Marlowe sat in stunned silence. $275 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow orange and gold, Marlowe and Delphine stood in front of the stone wall. Marlowe held the iron key, his heart pounding. One turn. That's all it would take. One turn, and whatever Uncle Silas had hidden would be revealed. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Delphine asked softly. "Once we know, we can't unknow it." Marlowe thought about their children, about the cruelty and greed that had driven them here. He thought about the years of scraping by, of going without, of working until his body broke. He thought about being called a burden. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." He slid the key into the hole. It fit perfectly. He turned it, feeling mechanisms deep inside the wall click and shift. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the stone door cracked open. Cold air, colder even than the mountain air around them, flowed out from the darkness beyond. Marlowe pushed the door wider, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into the mountain. Delphine gripped his hand. "Together?" "Together," he confirmed. They descended into the darkness, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the black. 30 feet down, the stairs ended at a massive chamber carved from solid rock, and there, in the cold and the dark, they found Uncle Silas's secret. The beam of Marlowe's flashlight swept across the chamber, and what it revealed made his breath catch somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The space was enormous, maybe 50 feet wide and twice as long, carved directly into the mountain stone with precision that must have taken years. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and the temperature down here was constant, cold but not freezing, perfectly preserved by the earth itself. But it wasn't the chamber that stole their breath. It was what filled it. Along every wall stood steel shelving units, industrial grade, the kind used in bank vaults or museums. and on those shelves, organized with obsessive care, sat rows and rows of sealed containers, plastic storage bins, metal cases, wooden crates marked with dates and labels in Uncle Silas's meticulous handwriting. Marlowe took a step forward, his legs unsteady. Delphine's hand tightened around his as they moved deeper into the space. Their flashlights played across labels, precious metals, bearer bonds, rare coins, gemstones, art documentation, currency reserves. "This isn't real," Delphine whispered. "It can't be real." But it was real. Marlowe opened the nearest container with trembling hands. Inside, nestled in foam padding, were gold coins. Dozens of them, each in its own protective case with authentication certificates attached. He held one up to his flashlight. Double Eagle, $20, 1877, mint condition. The certificate listed its value at $47,000 for one coin. There were at least 50 coins in this container alone. Delphine had moved to another shelf and opened a metal case. Her gasp echoed through the chamber. Marlowe joined her and looked inside. Stacks of bills, $100 bills, wrapped in bank bands and organized by year, 1953, 1961, 1972. The money was pristine, uncirculated, each stack marked with its count, $10,000 per stack, 30 stacks in the case, $300,000, just in this one case. And there were dozens of cases. Marlowe's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the cold stone floor, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Delphine knelt beside him, her face pale in the flashlight glow, her expression somewhere between wonder and terror. "How?" she breathed. "How did he get all this?" Marlowe shook his head, unable to speak. They sat there for a long time, maybe minutes, maybe hours, time losing all meaning in the underground chamber. Finally, Marlowe forced himself to stand. They moved through the vault methodically now, cataloguing with their eyes what Uncle Silas had spent a lifetime accumulating. One entire section was dedicated to precious metals. Gold bars, each one marked with weight and purity, stacked like bricks. Marlowe counted them. 200 bars. Each bar weighed roughly 400 troy ounces. He did the math in his head, his carpenter's brain still capable of calculations even while reeling. At current prices, that was somewhere around $90 million in gold alone. 90 million. Another section held rare coins from around the world. Chinese pandas, South African krugerrands, Canadian maple leafs, American eagles. Thousands of them, each authenticated, each catalogued. Delphine found a section dedicated to gemstones. Loose diamonds in sealed cases, emeralds, sapphires, rubies, all certified, all documented. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the filing cabinets. 6 of them, lined up against the back wall. Marlowe opened the first drawer and found it filled with documents. Stock certificates from the 1950s and 60s, companies like IBM, Coca-Cola, General Electric. Many were still valid, never cashed, potentially worth fortunes now after decades of splits and dividends. Another drawer held bearer bonds, anonymous debt securities that could be redeemed by whoever possessed them. The amounts were staggering: $50,000, $100,000. Bonds issued by the U.S. Treasury in the 1940s and 50s, before they were discontinued. Delphine pulled out a folder labeled Simply Inventory and opened it. Inside was a handwritten ledger, page after page of Uncle Silas's careful documentation. Each item in the vault was listed with its acquisition date, purchase price, and estimated current value as of 1992, the year he must have made his final update. She turned to the last page and read the total aloud, her voice breaking. $275,300,000. The number hung in the air between them like something solid, something that had weight and mass. Marlowe looked around the chamber, at the shelves and cases and containers, at the evidence of Uncle Silas's entire life's work. This wasn't stolen. The documentation was too thorough, too meticulous, Silas had acquired this legally, piece by piece, over decades. But why? Why accumulate all this wealth just to bury it in a mountain? Marlowe found the answer in a letter tucked into the front of the inventory ledger. It was dated April 1st, 1992, the day before Uncle Silas's final journal entry. The handwriting was shakier than the other documents, the hand of a dying man. To whoever finds this, it began. My name is Silas Henry Hendricks. I was born in 1923 and I will die soon. The doctor says my heart is failing. Good, I'm tired. This collection represents 57 years of work. I started in 1935 when I was 12 years old, collecting pennies from my paper route. I kept collecting through the Depression, through the war, through every boom and bust since. I worked hard. I invested carefully. I never married, never had children, never spent money on anything but the essentials and the collection. People called me crazy. Maybe I was. I didn't trust banks after the Depression, didn't trust the stock market after the crash, didn't trust the government after they took our gold in '33. So I kept everything physical, tangible, real. Things that would hold value no matter what happened to paper money or digital accounts. They said I was paranoid. They were right. In the 1970s, people found out I had wealth. They came after it. Some legally through lawsuits and claims, some not so legally. There were break-ins, threats. One night, 3 men tried to force their way into my house. I shot one of them, killed him. Self-defense, the sheriff said. But I knew more would come, so I moved here, to the middle of nowhere, and I built this vault. Spent 2 years carving it out of the mountain, another year moving everything here in secret. And then I sealed it up and never told anyone. I could have sold it all, lived in luxury. But what would be the point? Money didn't make me happy. Collecting did. Having it did. Knowing that no matter what happened in the world, I had something real. Something that couldn't be inflated away or stolen by banks or seized by governments. Now I'm dying and it doesn't matter anymore. If you're reading this, then you own the property, which means you own this vault and everything in it. It's legally yours. I made sure of that. The property deed includes mineral rights and all structures, visible or otherwise. Do with it what you will. Spend it. Give it away. Hide it like I did. I don't care anymore. But I'll tell you this, wealth like this changes people. It changed me. It isolated me. It made me suspicious of everyone. It cost me every relationship I ever had. So be careful. Some people will do anything for money. Some people already have. And if word gets out that you have this, they'll come for you just like they came for me. Good luck. You're going to need it. Silas H. Hendricks. Marlowe read the letter twice, then handed it to Delphine. She read it in silence, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at Marlowe with haunted eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. "I don't know," Marlowe admitted. He looked around the chamber again, seeing it differently now. Not as a treasure vault, but as a tomb. Uncle Silas had built himself a prison and died in it, alone, paranoid, convinced the world was trying to take what he'd earned. And maybe he'd been right. They climbed back up the stone stairs in silence, sealed the door behind them, and returned to the cabin. The fire had burned low while they were gone, and the room was cold. Marlowe rebuilt it mechanically, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind spun in circles. Delphine made coffee with shaking hands. They sat together on the sofa, wrapped in blankets, staring at the fire and trying to comprehend what had just become their reality. They were possibly 2 of the wealthiest people in Montana, maybe in the country. And they were living in a cabin with no electricity, no running water beyond a hand pump, no heat except what they could generate from burning wood. The irony was almost funny. Almost. "We can't tell anyone," Delphine said finally. Her voice was firm, decided. "If people find out, everything Uncle Silas feared will happen to us." Marlowe nodded. "But we also can't just sit on it forever. There are taxes, legal issues. And we need to know if it's really ours or if someone could challenge the inheritance. We need a lawyer, Delphine said. Someone trustworthy. In these mountains, Marlowe shook his head. Everyone knows everyone. Word would spread. Then someone from outside. Billings, maybe. Or Bozeman. They fell silent again. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. The cabin creaked and settled, old timbers adjusting to the cold. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. I keep thinking about the kids, Delphine said quietly, about Sutton and Thaddeus and Lennox, about what they said to us, that we were worthless, that we had nothing to give them. Marlowe's jaw tightened. They made their choice. But what if they find out? What if somehow word gets back to them about this place, about Uncle Silas, about the rumors? Then we deal with it, Marlowe said. But I'm not giving them a damn penny, not after what they did, not after how they treated us. Delphine looked at him, surprised by the hardness in his voice. Her Marlowe, who'd been gentle his whole life, who'd never held a grudge, who'd forgiven their children 1,000 small cruelties over the years. You really mean that, she said. I really mean it, he confirmed. They wanted their inheritance while we were still alive. They wanted to warehouse us and take what little we had. Well, now we have everything and they have nothing. And maybe that's exactly what they deserve. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Marlowe lay awake listening to Delphine's breathing, to the wind outside, to the settling of the cabin. His mind kept returning to the chamber beneath their feet, to the fortune in gold and gems and paper that sat waiting in the dark. It felt like standing on thin ice, knowing that any moment it could crack and plunge them into cold water they couldn't survive. Morning came grey and bitter. Marlowe rose stiff and sore, his 72-year-old body protesting the previous day's exertion and emotional strain. He built the fire, made coffee, tried to establish normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Delphine was quiet through breakfast, picking at the oatmeal she'd made from their dwindling supplies. Finally, she spoke. I've been thinking. We need to document everything ourselves. Photograph it, create our own inventory, make sure we know exactly what's down there. Uncle Silas's records are good, but they're 30 years old. We need current information. Marlowe nodded. Made sense. Over the next 3 days, they made multiple trips down into the vault. Delphine had brought their old digital camera, and she photographed every container, every certificate, every piece of documentation they could find. Marlowe kept a notebook, creating a detailed map of the chamber and its contents. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Each container they opened revealed more wealth, more proof that their lives had changed in ways they couldn't fully grasp. They found art documentation for paintings Uncle Silas had apparently purchased in the 1960s, works by artists Marlowe had never heard of, but that were listed in the ledger as worth millions. The paintings themselves weren't in the vault, probably sold or donated or lost over the years, but the provenance documents remained. They found collections of rare books, first editions sealed in protective cases. They found antique jewelry, estate pieces Uncle Silas had acquired at auctions. They found ammunition, boxes and boxes of it. And Marlowe understood that Uncle Silas had been prepared not just to hide his wealth, but to defend it. By the 4th day, they had a comprehensive inventory. Delphine had filled 3 notebooks with descriptions and values. They'd taken over 800 photographs, and they'd confirmed what the letter had stated. The conservative estimate of $275 million was probably low. With appreciation over the last 30 years, especially in gold prices and rare coins, the actual value could be closer to $400 million. The number was meaningless. It was too large to comprehend, too abstract to feel real. What did feel real was the weight of it, the burden. Uncle Silas had died carrying this secret. Now it was theirs. On the 5th day after the discovery, Birdie showed up again. Marlowe heard her jeep before he saw it, and his immediate reaction was panic. What if she knew? What if somehow she'd heard or seen something? But Birdie was just being neighborly. She'd brought fresh venison from a deer her grandson had shot, wrapped in butcher paper and frozen solid. "Figured you could use some protein," she said, handing it to Delphine. "Can't live on canned goods all winter." They invited her in for coffee, trying to act normal, but Marlowe could feel the tension in his shoulders, the way his voice sounded too tight. Birdie noticed. She always noticed. "You folks all right?" she asked, studying them over the rim of her coffee cup. "You seem jumpy." "Just adjusting," Delphine said quickly. "It's been a big change." Birdie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard anything strange? Seen anyone poking around?" "No," Marlowe said, perhaps too quickly. "Why?" Birdie shrugged. "Probably nothing. But there was a fella in town last week asking questions about the old Hendricks property. Said he was a historian doing research on mountain settlers. Showed particular interest in Silas." Marlowe's blood went cold. What kind of questions? Where exactly the property was? If anyone lived here now? If there were any stories about Silas having valuable collections? Birdie set down her cup. "I didn't tell him nothing. Told him Silas kept to himself, and that was that. But it struck me as odd. Most historians don't go sniffing around asking about valuables." "What did he look like?" Delphine asked, her voice barely steady. "Mid-40s, maybe? Expensive jacket, city shoes, completely wrong for mountain country. Drove a new Lexus SUV, which is a stupid vehicle for these roads." Birdie looked between them. "You know him?" "No," Marlowe said. "But thank you for not telling him anything." Birdie stood, pulling on her coat. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, and maybe I don't want to know. But Silas was paranoid for a reason. People talked about him having money, having valuables. Most folks thought it was just rumors, but rumors have a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention." She paused at the door. "You need anything, you come get me. And if you see anyone unfamiliar around here, you let me know. Understood?" They understood. After she left, Marlowe and Delphine looked at each other with shared fear. Already, someone was asking questions. Already, the secret was trying to escape. That night, Marlowe couldn't sleep. He got up around midnight and stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape bathed in moonlight. And that's when he saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the tree line toward the cabin, then circling around back toward where the vault entrance was hidden. Someone had been here. Someone had been walking around their property in the middle of the night. Marlowe woke Delphine quietly. She came to the window and saw the tracks. Her hand found his and gripped tight. "We need to be more careful," she whispered. "Maybe we should move the key, hide it better." "Or maybe we need to get ahead of this," Marlowe said. "Talk to a lawyer. Figure out our legal standing before someone forces our hand." The next morning, Marlowe drove the truck down the mountain to the nearest town with a phone line. Cook City, barely more than a handful of buildings and a gas station, but it had a payphone that worked. He'd found the number for a law firm in Bozeman that specialized in estate law. The call was brief, guarded. Marlowe explained he'd inherited property with significant assets and needed legal counsel. The attorney, a man named Walter Cross, agreed to meet with them but insisted it be discreet. "Bring documentation," he said, "and don't tell anyone else you're coming." The drive to Bozeman took 4 hours through treacherous mountain roads. Marlowe and Delphine made the trip 3 days later, carrying copies of Uncle Silas's ledger and the property deed, leaving the actual valuables safely locked in the vault. Walter Cross's office was in a modest building downtown, nothing flashy or expensive-looking. The man himself was in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent time in mountain country before becoming a lawyer. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and whistled low. 275 million, possibly more. And it's all documented? Marlowe handed over copies of the inventory. Walter spent 20 minutes reviewing them, his expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, he looked up. The good news is, this appears to be completely legal. Your uncle acquired everything legitimately, paid taxes on his income, and the property transfer to you is clean. As the legal owner of the property and all structures thereon, you own the contents of that vault. And the bad news? Delphine asked. The bad news is that once you begin accessing this wealth, questions will be asked. The IRS will want to know where it came from. Banks will file reports for large transactions. If you try to sell any significant amount of gold or coins, dealers are required to report it. He leaned forward. This fortune will be very difficult to convert to usable assets without attracting attention. And attention, based on what you've told me, is exactly what you don't want. So what do we do? Marlowe asked. Walter thought for a moment. We establish a trust. Put the assets into a legal entity that protects them and protects you. We work with specialized dealers who understand discretion. We liquidate slowly, carefully, over years if necessary. And most importantly, he met their eyes. You tell absolutely no one about this. Not family, not friends, not your children, especially if there's any chance they might contest the inheritance. They won't, Marlowe said firmly. They don't even know we're here. But the question hung in the air between all of them. For how long? Walter Cross worked quickly. Within 2 weeks, he'd established the Hendricks Family Trust, a legal entity that existed on paper but revealed nothing about the assets it protected. He connected them with a private numismatist in Denver who specialized in high-value rare coin transactions and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. And he advised them to move carefully, slowly, never drawing attention. But careful and slow weren't options they'd have for long. Marlowe and Delphine returned to the cabin to find more footprints. This time, someone had been right up to the back wall, right where the vault entrance was hidden. They'd even brushed away some of the snow, exposing the stone. Marlowe's hands shook as he examined the disturbed area. They know, he said quietly. They don't know what they're looking for exactly, but they know something's here. That night, Marlowe didn't go to bed. He sat in the dark by the window with Uncle Silas's rifle across his lap, watching. At 2:17 in the morning, he saw movement. A shadow detaching from the tree line, moving toward the cabin with deliberate stealth. Marlowe's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched the figure circle the cabin, testing windows, trying the door. When the shadow moved toward the back where the vault was hidden, Marlowe made a decision. He stepped outside onto the porch, the rifle raised but not aimed. The figure froze. In the moonlight, Marlowe could make out a man, mid-40s like Birdie had described, wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked brand new and completely impractical. City clothes pretending to be mountain wear. "You're on private property," Marlowe called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The man raised his hands slowly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm a bit lost. My GP's died and I've been wandering for hours." At 2 in the morning? Marlowe didn't lower the rifle. In the middle of winter? On a dead-end road? The man's expression shifted, the false friendliness sliding away. He lowered his hands. "Okay, let's be honest. My name is Garrett Bishop. I'm a private acquisition specialist. I work for collectors who are interested in rare items." "Not interested," Marlowe said. "You don't even know what I'm offering." Garrett took a step closer. Marlowe raised the rifle higher. The man stopped. "I know about Silas Hendricks. I know he spent his life collecting valuables. And I know that collection never surfaced after his death. Which means it's either still here or you've already found it. There's nothing here but an old cabin and an old man who wants to be left alone." Garrett smiled, cold and calculating. See, I don't think that's true. Because 3 months ago, a property that hadn't been touched in 30 years suddenly showed signs of occupancy. Smoke from the chimney, fresh tire tracks, and then 2 elderly people matching your description showed up in town asking careful questions about estate law. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up. Marlowe could just make out a photograph. It looked like surveillance footage from a security camera. Him and Delphine entering Walter Cross's office building. "You've been following us." Marlowe's voice went flat and dangerous. "I've been doing my job." Garrett pocketed the phone. "My clients are willing to pay top dollar for Silas's collection. Name your price. 50 million. 100 million. You walk away rich and nobody has to know what was here. And if I say no?" Garrett's smile widened. "Then things get complicated. The IRS might receive an anonymous tip about unreported assets. Your children, Sutton, Thaddeus, and Lennox, I believe, might learn their estranged parents are sitting on a fortune they hid from them. Legal challenges could be filed questioning the validity of the inheritance." He spread his hands. "Or you take the money, live out your remaining years in comfort, and everyone walks away happy." Marlowe's finger moved to the rifle's trigger. He wasn't going to shoot, but Garrett didn't need to know that. "You have 10 seconds to get off my property." Garrett didn't move for a long moment, studying Marlowe with the calculating gaze of someone used to getting what he wanted. Then he shrugged. "Think about it. You know how to reach me." He pulled a business card from his pocket and dropped it in the snow. "The offer expires in 1 week. After that, well, I tried to do this the easy way." He walked back toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows. Marlowe stood on the porch until he heard an engine start somewhere in the distance, then watched headlights briefly illuminate the trees before fading away. Inside, Delphine was standing in the doorway to the bedroom, her face pale. "I heard everything," she whispered. "Marlowe, he knows about the children. He knows we're estranged. If he contacts them—" "They'll come," Marlowe finished. "They'll come and they'll fight us for every penny." He picked up the phone, the emergency satellite phone Walter had insisted they purchase. It was 3 a.m, but this couldn't wait. Walter answered on the 5th ring, groggy but alert. "We have a problem," Marlowe said. By dawn, Walter was putting emergency measures in place, restraining orders against Garrett Bishop and his company, enhanced security for the property records, and most importantly, documentation proving that Marlowe and Delphine had full legal ownership of the property and all contents before any of this started, sealed with timestamps and notarized records. But none of that would matter if Garrett followed through on his threat. 3 days later, he did. Marlowe was outside splitting wood when he heard vehicles approaching, multiple vehicles. His stomach dropped as 3 SUVs came into view, navigating the snowed-in road with difficulty but determination. They parked in a line near the cabin, and from the lead vehicle emerged Sutton, Thaddeus, and Lennox, his children, here, now. Marlowe set down the axe and waited, his face carefully neutral. Delphine appeared in the cabin doorway behind him, her hand pressed to her chest. Sutton approached first, his expression a mixture of anger and something like vindication. "Hello, Dad." "Surprise." "What are you doing here?" Marlowe asked, though he already knew. "What are we doing here?" Thaddeus laughed, harsh and bitter. "What are you doing here? Hiding out in the mountains playing hermit while sitting on a fortune?" So Garrett had made good on his threat. Lennox pushed past her brothers, her face flushed. "We got a very interesting phone call. About Uncle Silas. About his collection. About you finding it and hiding it from us." "There's nothing to hide," Marlowe said quietly. "This is my property. Anything on it is mine." "Legally," Sutton said, pulling out his phone. "We're not so sure about that. We've consulted with attorneys. In Montana, children can challenge estate distributions if there's evidence of undue influence or mental incompetence." "Mental incompetence?" Delphine's voice cracked. "You're going to claim we're incompetent? "Mom," Lennox said with false sweetness, "you're both in your 70s, living in a cabin with no electricity, no modern amenities. You left your home without telling anyone. That's not normal behavior. That's concerning behavior." "We left because you told us we were worthless burdens," Marlowe said, his voice rising. "You wanted to warehouse us and take our home. We chose to leave with our dignity." "And with Uncle Silas's fortune," Thaddeus added. "Fortune that should be split among the family, not hoarded by two old people who don't even know how to access it properly." Sutton stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to let us inventory whatever Uncle Silas left. We're going to have it properly appraised, and then we're going to discuss a fair distribution, because whether you like it or not, we're family. We have rights." "You have no rights here," Marlowe said. "You gave up those rights when you threw us away like trash." "Dad, be reasonable," Lennox pleaded. "Think about what's best for everyone. For Evelyn, your granddaughter, remember? She could use that money for college, for medical bills. We all could." The mention of his granddaughter hit Marlowe like a physical blow. Evelyn, Sutton's daughter, now 15. A girl he hadn't seen in over 2 years because her father had slowly cut off contact. Using her as leverage was a new low even for them. "Get off my property," Marlowe said, his voice shaking now with rage he could barely contain. "No," Sutton said flatly. "Not until we see what's here." He moved toward the cabin. Marlowe stepped in front of him. Sutton was larger, younger, stronger. He pushed past his father easily, and Marlowe stumbled. Delphine cried out, running to help him. Thaddeus and Lennox followed Sutton inside. The children began searching the cabin, throwing open cabinets, checking under furniture, their entitlement absolute and shameless. Marlowe stood in the doorway, Delphine beside him, both watching their children tear through their home. "There's nothing here," Thaddeus said after 10 minutes. "Just old furniture and some supplies." "Then there's nothing to see," Marlowe said. "Now leave." But Lennox had wandered outside. She was walking the perimeter, and Marlowe's blood ran cold as he watched her approach the back of the cabin. She stopped at the stone wall, examining it. "This is interesting," she called out. "Why would someone build a wall like this against the mountain? It's too carefully constructed to be just decorative." Sutton and Thaddeus joined her. Marlowe followed, his heart pounding. The 3 siblings were running their hands along the stone, and Marlowe knew it was only a matter of time before they found what he'd found. The seam, the keyhole. "There," Sutton said, his fingers tracing the outline. "This is a door." Marlowe's world tilted. Delphine grabbed his arm, both of them frozen with dread. "Where's the key, Dad?" Sutton turned to face him. "Where's the key to whatever Uncle Silas hid down there?" "There is no key," Marlowe lied. "That's just old foundation work. There's nothing behind it." "Liar," Thaddeus spat. "You wouldn't be this defensive if there was nothing there." Sutton pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. We found it. There's definitely a sealed entrance." He listened for a moment. "Understood. We'll wait." He hung up and smiled at Marlowe. "Help is coming." 20 minutes later, 2 more vehicles arrived. Private security, hired by Garrett Bishop, Marlowe realized with sinking certainty. 4 men in tactical gear, carrying tools. They approached the stone door and began examining it. "You can't do this," Delphine said, her voice breaking. "This is our property. You're trespassing." "Try to stop us," Sutton said coldly. One of the security men produced what looked like a small explosive charge. They're going to blow it open, Marlowe realized, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He was an old man. Delphine was an old woman. His own children were robbing them with hired muscle, and the isolation that had felt like safety now felt like a trap. The security team placed the charge carefully at what they'd identified as the weakest point of the door mechanism. Everyone moved back. Marlowe grabbed Delphine and pulled her around the corner of the cabin, covering her body with his. The explosion was smaller than he'd expected, a sharp crack rather than a boom, but effective. When the smoke cleared, the stone door hung open, its locking mechanism destroyed. Sutton, Thaddeus, and Lennox didn't hesitate. They descended into the darkness, flashlights cutting the gloom. Marlowe and Delphine followed helplessly, listening to the gasps and exclamations as their children discovered what they'd been seeking. "Holy God," Thaddeus breathed. "It's real. It's all real." "Look at this gold," Lennox's voice echoed up from below. "There must be millions. Tens of millions." Marlowe reached the bottom of the stairs to find his 3 children standing in the middle of the vault chamber, surrounded by Uncle Silas's life work, their faces illuminated by flashlight beams and naked greed. Sutton turned to face his father, and Marlowe saw no love there, no recognition of family bonds, only calculation and triumph. "This changes everything, Dad. You understand that, right? You can't keep this. You won't keep this." "It's mine," Marlowe said, but his voice sounded small and defeated in the vast stone chamber. "Your uncle left it to me. Legally, it's mine." "We'll see what the courts say," Sutton replied. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures. Thaddeus and Lennox were opening containers, examining coins and certificates like children on Christmas morning. Marlowe felt Delphine's hand in his and realized she was weeping silently. They'd fled their old life to escape their children's cruelty, and their children had followed them here. They'd discovered a fortune that could have given them security and peace, and now it was being taken from them just like everything else. But as Marlowe watched Sutton photograph the gold bars, watched Thaddeus stuff rare coins into his pockets, watched Lennox sort through documents she couldn't possibly understand, something shifted inside him. Not resignation, not acceptance. Rage. Pure, clarifying rage. These were his children, yes, but they'd stopped being his family the moment they'd called him worthless, and he'd be damned if he'd let them steal what Uncle Silas had entrusted to him. "Get out," he said quietly. Sutton looked up from his phone. "What?" "Get out of this vault. Get off my property. Now." "Or what?" Thaddeus challenged. "You'll call the police? The nearest sheriff is an hour away. By the time anyone gets here, we'll have documented everything. We'll have evidence for our legal claim." "You're right," Marlowe said. "The sheriff is an hour away, which means for the next hour we're alone out here. No witnesses. No one to see what happens." He reached into his coat and pulled out Uncle Silas's rifle. "And I'm an old man with nothing left to lose protecting what's mine." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. The security men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But Marlowe wasn't aiming at anyone. He was simply making a point. "This vault, this property, everything in it belongs to me. Uncle Silas spent his entire life building this because people tried to take it from him. People like Garrett Bishop, people willing to use violence and threats and manipulation. He looked at each of his children in turn. People like you. And you know what Uncle Silas did? He shot a man who tried to take what was his, killed him in self-defense, and that was enough to make the others back off." "Dad, you're not going to shoot us," Lennox said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "No," Marlowe agreed. "I'm not going to shoot you, because despite everything, you're still my children. But I will defend my property with every means at my disposal. I will tie this up in courts for years. I will expose every dirty tactic you're using. I will make sure everyone knows you hired criminals to break into your elderly parents' home and terrorize them." He lowered the rifle slightly. "Or you can leave now. Leave and never come back. And maybe someday when you've learned what family actually means, we can talk again." The standoff lasted an eternity, compressed into seconds. The security men looked at Sutton, waiting for instructions. Sutton looked at the gold, at his father, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he nodded to the security team. "Let's go." "But this isn't over," he said to Marlowe. "We're filing legal action, conservatorship proceedings. We'll prove you're mentally unfit to manage assets of this magnitude." "Try," Marlowe said. "My lawyer's better than yours." The children and their hired help filed out of the vault, up the stairs, back to their vehicles. Marlowe and Delphine stood at the entrance and watched them leave, engines growling as the SUVs navigated back down the treacherous mountain road. Only when the last sound of engines faded did Marlowe lower the rifle. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Delphine caught it, set it aside, and wrapped her arms around him. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the cold mountain air, both crying now for everything they'd lost and everything they'd almost lost again. "We need to call Walter," Delphine said finally. Marlowe nodded. "But first we need to secure this vault. The door's damaged. Anyone could get in now." They spent the rest of the day working. Marlowe used tools from Uncle Silas's workshop to repair the locking mechanism as best he could. It wouldn't keep out a determined thief with explosives, but it would keep out casual intruders. They also set up motion-activated cameras that connected to their satellite internet, a modern security measure Uncle Silas never had. When Walter arrived the next morning, having driven through the night after Marlowe's emergency call, he surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "This is bad," he said. "They know what's here now. They have photos, evidence. They'll absolutely file legal challenges." "Can they win?" Delphine asked. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, it depends on the judge. Montana law does allow adult children to petition for conservatorship of elderly parents if there's evidence of diminished capacity, and living off-grid at your age, combined with the magnitude of assets involved, could be construed as concerning. So we could lose everything," Marlowe said. "Not if we're smart," Walter replied. He pulled out his briefcase and extracted documents. "I've been preparing for this possibility. We're going to establish your competence beyond any doubt. Full medical evaluations showing you're both of sound mind. Financial plans demonstrating you can responsibly manage the assets. Character witnesses. And most importantly," he looked at them seriously, "we're going to show that you're not hoarding this wealth selfishly. You're protecting it and planning to use it for good." "What do you mean?" Delphine asked. Walter smiled slightly. "Nobody can argue you're mentally incompetent if you're establishing a charitable foundation, if you're planning to donate significant portions to causes that matter, if you're being responsible stewards rather than greedy hoarders." He spread the documents on the cabin's table. "So tell me, if you could do anything with this fortune besides just sit on it, what would you do?" Marlowe and Delphine looked at each other. They'd been so focused on survival, on protecting what they'd found, that they hadn't thought about purpose. But now, faced with the question, Delphine spoke first. "Education," she said. "Kids who can't afford college, who have the grades and the drive but not the money." "Medical care," Marlowe added, thinking of his own unpaid hospital bills. "People who need treatment but can't afford it, especially elderly people." Walter was writing quickly. "Good. What else?" "Support for small mountain communities," Delphine said, warming to the idea. "Places like this that are dying because young people have to leave to find work. Maybe we could fund programs that help them stay. Housing assistance for elderly people," Marlowe said, "so they don't get pressured into selling their homes against their will." By the time they finished, they had the outline of something bigger than themselves. The Hendricks Foundation, Walter suggested, focused on education, healthcare access, rural community support, and elderly assistance. "We establish it immediately, transfer a significant portion of the vault assets into it, and you become administrators rather than just owners. That makes it much harder for your children to claim you're hoarding wealth irresponsibly. But that means giving it away," Marlowe said. "Most of it." "Yes," Walter confirmed. "Is that a problem?" Marlowe thought about Uncle Silas, who'd died alone, paranoid, his fortune untouched and unused. He thought about his children consumed by greed, willing to destroy their relationship with their parents for money. He thought about what actually mattered, not the gold sitting in a vault, but the warmth of Delphine's hand in his, the knowledge that they'd stood together when it mattered most. "No," he said finally. "It's not a problem. In fact, it's the only thing that makes sense. Delphine squeezed his hand. "We'll keep enough to live comfortably," she said, "to fix up this cabin, to not worry about bills. But the rest, it should help people who actually need it." Walter nodded, satisfaction crossing his face. "Then let's make it official, and let's make it bulletproof. Your children are going to fight this, but when they do, they'll discover they're not fighting two helpless elderly people anymore. They're fighting a legally established foundation with clear humanitarian purposes, and that's a fight they can't win without looking like monsters." The legal work took 3 weeks. Medical evaluations confirmed Marlowe and Delphine were both mentally competent. Character witnesses, including Birdie and several people from town who'd met them, testified to their sound judgment. The Hendricks Foundation was established with an initial endowment of $200 million, with plans to responsibly liquidate vault assets over time to fund programs. And through it all, Marlowe and Delphine worked on the cabin, making it truly theirs, adding proper insulation, upgrading the wood stove, creating a home that would sustain them through winters to come. They were splitting firewood together one afternoon when they heard vehicles again. Marlowe tensed. But these weren't SUVs. It was the sheriff's department, and with them, federal agents. Marlowe's stomach dropped. But the lead agent, a woman named Harris, approached with official documents, not handcuffs. "Mr. Hendricks, we've received multiple complaints about this property. Allegations of stolen assets, tax evasion, illegal hoarding of currency." She paused. "We've investigated all of them, and they're baseless. Your attorney provided extensive documentation. Everything here was legally acquired and is being legally managed. The foundation you've established is actually exemplary." She handed him a document. "This is official clearance. You're in full compliance with all federal and state laws." "So the complaints," Marlowe said, "came from your children and a Mr. Garrett Bishop," Agent Harris confirmed. "All have been dismissed. Mr. Bishop is actually under investigation himself now for harassment and attempted extortion." She looked around at the property. "You've got a beautiful place here. Use it well." After they left, Marlowe and Delphine stood in the snow and looked at each other. It was over. The fight was over. They'd won. That night, sitting by the fire in their cabin, Delphine leaned against Marlowe's shoulder. "What do you think Uncle Silas would say?" she asked. "About what we're doing with his collection?" Marlowe thought about the bitter, paranoid man who'd died alone defending his fortune from the world. "I think," he said slowly, "maybe he'd be relieved. He protected it because he didn't trust anyone to use it right. But we're giving him a different legacy. Not the man who hoarded wealth and died alone, but the man whose lifetime of work ended up helping thousands of people." Delphine smiled. "That's a better story." "It is," Marlowe agreed. "And maybe that's what we all want in the end. Not to be remembered for what we had, but for what we gave." Outside, the mountain wind howled and snow fell in silent waves. But inside the cabin, warm and safe, 2 people who'd been discarded and forgotten had found not just fortune, but purpose. And that, they both knew, was worth more than all the gold in Uncle Silas's vault. Spring came to the Bridger Mountains with hesitant warmth, melting snow revealing green earth beneath. The cabin looked different now, restored and weathered at the same time, a place that belonged to the mountain rather than fighting against it. Marlowe stood on the newly rebuilt porch, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the valley below emerge from winter's grip. It had been 4 months since the confrontation with their children. 4 months since the federal investigation cleared them. 4 months since the Hendricks Foundation became real, transforming from legal documents into something that actually changed lives. The first scholarship had been awarded in February. A girl from Red Lodge, 17 years old, whose single father worked 3 jobs but still couldn't afford to send her to college. She'd been accepted to Montana State with a perfect grade point average and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. The Hendricks Foundation gave her a full ride, 4 years, room and board, books, everything. Walter had shown them the video of the moment she'd found out. The girl had collapsed into her father's arms, both of them crying, and Marlowe had watched that video a dozen times, each time feeling something unlock in his chest. This was what the money was for. Not sitting in a vault, not feeding his children's greed, but this. Changing futures, opening doors. By March, the foundation had awarded 12 more scholarships, established a medical assistance fund that had already helped 43 families pay for necessary treatments, funded a rural community center in Prey, Montana, where kids could go after school instead of sitting alone in empty houses while their parents worked. Delphine managed the applications personally. She'd set up a small office in what had been the cabin's loft, with a proper desk and a laptop and internet that worked most of the time. She read every scholarship essay, every medical funding request, every community proposal. And she cried over many of them, Marlowe knew, though she tried to hide it. "We're not just giving away money," she'd told him one night. "We're giving away hope. We're telling people they matter, that their dreams matter, that someone sees them. And maybe that's what we needed most, too, to be seen." Word spread, as word always does in small communities. People knew there was money up on the mountain, though they didn't know how much or where it came from exactly. They knew the Hendricks couple who'd appeared out of nowhere and quietly started changing lives. Some were grateful, some were suspicious, some were simply curious. Birdie had become their closest friend and the foundation's first board member. She helped vet applications, identified genuine need versus opportunism, and used her lifetime of mountain knowledge to guide their decisions. Trust her, Walter had advised. And they did. One afternoon in late March, Birdie arrived at the cabin with a teenager in tow. A boy, maybe 16, thin and nervous, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "This is Marcus," Birdie said. "His situation's complicated. Figured you should hear it directly." They sat around the kitchen table, and Marcus told his story haltingly. His mother had died when he was 12. His father worked construction, but got injured 2 years ago, couldn't work anymore, started drinking. Marcus had been taking care of everything, working part-time at a grocery store, trying to keep up with school, managing his father's disability paperwork. He was smart, Birdie interjected, really smart. His teachers said he could get into any engineering program in the country if he just had a chance. "But I can't leave," Marcus said, staring at the table. "If I go to college, there's nobody to take care of my dad. And we can't afford caregivers or facilities or any of that. So I'll graduate high school, get a full-time job, and that'll be it." He looked up, meeting Marlowe's eyes. "I'm not asking for money. Birdie just said you might know about resources, programs, something that could help." Marlowe felt like he was looking at a younger version of himself, a kid trying to hold everything together, sacrificing his own future because nobody else would step up. He glanced at Delphine. She nodded slightly. "What if," Marlowe said slowly, "the foundation could provide care for your father? Professional help, medical support, whatever he needs. And also fund your education. Would you go to college then?" Marcus blinked. "That would cost. That's too much." "Let us worry about the cost," Delphine said gently. "You just worry about your grades and your future." The boy broke down, just collapsed forward onto the table and sobbed, 16 years of holding everything together, finally cracking open. Birdie put a hand on his shoulder and let him cry. When he left an hour later with a scholarship letter and a care plan for his father, Marlowe stood at the window and watched him walk to Birdie's jeep. The kid's shoulders were straighter, his head higher. One life, Marlowe thought. That's one life we just changed completely. "How many more are out there?" he asked aloud. "How many kids like him, carrying impossible weights, thinking nobody cares?" "Thousands," Delphine said quietly. "Tens of thousands. And we can't help them all. But we can help as many as we can." By April, the Foundation's work had attracted attention beyond the small towns. A reporter from the Billings Gazette showed up asking questions. Marlowe and Delphine refused interviews, but Walter issued a statement about the Foundation's mission and structure. The resulting article was published on page 3 of the Sunday edition. Elderly couple uses inherited fortune to transform Montana communities. The article was fair, mostly accurate, and brought more applicants than they could possibly handle. It also brought their children back into their lives. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in mid-April. Marlowe recognized Sutton's handwriting on the envelope. His first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but Delphine stopped him. "We should know what it says," she said, "even if it's just more threats." It wasn't threats. It was something worse. An apology. "Dear Mum and Dad," Sutton had written in his precise, careful script. "I saw the article about the Foundation. I've spent the last few weeks thinking about it, about you, about everything that happened. I need you to know I'm ashamed. Not because you found money and didn't share it, though that's what I told myself at first. I'm ashamed because you showed me exactly what kind of person I'd become, and I didn't like what I saw. You were right about everything. We treated you horribly. We saw you as burdens instead of parents. We cared more about inheritance than relationship. And when we found out about Uncle Silas's collection, our first thought wasn't happiness for you. It was anger that we weren't getting a piece of it. That's not who I want to be. That's not who Dad raised me to be. You worked your whole life to give us everything, and we repaid you with cruelty and greed. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that what you're doing with the Foundation, helping kids and families who actually need it, it's incredible. It's what heroes do. And I'm sorry I couldn't see that you were heroes all along. Thaddeus and Lennox asked me to tell you they're sorry too. We've been talking, really talking for the first time in years, about what we did and who we've become. It's not pretty, but maybe acknowledging it is the first step to being better. If you ever feel like talking, I'd like to hear from you. Not about money, not about inheritance. I just want to hear about your lives, about what you're doing, about who you are now. I want to know my parents again, if you'll let me. Your son Sutton." Delphine read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Marlowe read it once and set it aside, his jaw tight. "What do you think?" Delphine asked. "I think people say they're sorry when they realize they're not getting what they want. That's not fair, Marlowe. People can change." "Can they?" He stood and walked to the window. "Or do they just change their tactics?" Delphine came to stand beside him. "I'm not saying we forgive them immediately. I'm not saying we forget what they did. But I am saying maybe we don't close the door completely. Maybe we leave it open just a crack. Why? After everything?" "Because," she said softly, "we're building a foundation on the principle that people deserve second chances. That past mistakes don't define futures. How can we give that to strangers, but not to our own children?" Marlowe was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "If we respond, it's on our terms. Slow, careful. They have to earn trust back, not just expect it because they wrote a nice letter." "Agreed," Delphine said. She wrote back a week later. A short note. "Thank you for your letter. We appreciate the apology. We're not ready for a full reunion, but we're open to occasional correspondence. Tell us about your lives. We'll tell you about ours." "Small steps." Sutton's reply came quickly. He wrote about his daughter Evelyn, now 15, struggling with anxiety and pressure at school. He wrote about his marriage, which was strained after years of prioritizing work over family. He wrote about slowly realizing that chasing money had cost him everything that actually mattered. Thaddeus sent his own letter, shorter, more awkward, but sincere. He admitted the car dealership was failing because he'd made bad decisions trying to appear successful rather than actually being successful. He'd lost his house, was living in an apartment, learning humility the hard way. Lennox's letter was perhaps the most painful. She wrote about her son, 8 years old, who barely knew his grandparents. She wrote about her own mother, Delphine, and how she'd taken for granted all those years of unconditional love. I thought being independent meant not needing anyone, she wrote, but really I was just lonely and didn't know how to admit it. The correspondence continued through spring. Careful, tentative, like people learning to walk after a long injury. Marlowe remained guarded, but Delphine slowly softened. She sent photos of the cabin, of the mountain in bloom. The children sent photos of their families, of grandchildren Marlowe and Delphine barely knew. One day in May, Delphine suggested they invite the kids to visit. Not to stay, just for an afternoon. Marlowe resisted at first, but eventually agreed. One afternoon, on their territory, with clear boundaries. The children arrived on a Saturday in late May. 3 vehicles, 3 families, all looking nervous and uncertain as they parked near the cabin. Marlowe and Delphine stood on the porch watching them approach. Evelyn, Sutton's daughter, ran ahead. She was tall now, nearly grown, with Delphine's eyes and Marlowe's stubborn chin. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly shy. "Grandma? Grandpa?" Delphine opened her arms, and Evelyn collapsed into them, crying, "I missed you so much. Why did we stop seeing each other?" "Because adults sometimes make terrible decisions," Delphine said, holding her granddaughter tight. "But we're trying to fix that now." The afternoon was awkward, stilted, everyone trying too hard to be normal when nothing was normal. But there were moments. Marlowe showing his grandson how to split wood properly. Delphine teaching Evelyn to make bread in the old stone oven. Sutton and Marlowe standing together on the porch, not talking much, just existing in the same space without anger. As evening approached and families prepared to leave, Sutton pulled Marlowe aside. "I know you don't trust me yet," he said. "I understand why, but I want you to know I'm not the same person who showed up here demanding money. Seeing what you've built, what you're doing with the foundation, it changed something in me. You're helping people who have nothing because you remember what that was like. That's real wealth. Not what's in the vault, but what's in your hearts." Marlowe studied his son's face, looking for deception, for manipulation. But all he saw was genuine remorse and something like admiration. "We'll see," Marlowe said finally. "Words are easy. It's the actions over time that matter." "I understand," Sutton said. "I'll prove it to you, however long it takes." After they left, Marlowe and Delphine sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted orange and purple and gold, the colors reflecting off lingering snow on the highest peaks. "What do you think?" Delphine asked. "Can we trust them again?" "Maybe," Marlowe said. "Maybe not completely, maybe not for a long time, but maybe enough to let them back into our lives a little bit at a time." By June, the foundation had helped over 200 families. The vault beneath the cabin was slowly emptying as assets were carefully liquidated and converted to scholarships, medical payments, community investments. Walter estimated they'd distributed nearly $40 million in 6 months, all of it documented, legal, making real differences. The irony wasn't lost on Marlowe. Uncle Silas had spent 57 years accumulating wealth and died without spending a penny of it. They'd found it, and within months were giving it away as fast as they responsibly could. 2 completely opposite philosophies. 2 completely different outcomes. One afternoon, Marlowe was working in the garden they'd planted behind the cabin, tomatoes and beans and herbs that Delphine wanted for cooking. He heard a vehicle and looked up to see an unfamiliar truck. From it emerged a young woman, maybe 25, carrying a folder. "Mr. Hendricks?" she asked tentatively. "I'm Sarah Milliken. I received a Hendricks Foundation scholarship 4 years ago. It paid for my nursing degree." She held up the folder. "I wanted to show you something." Inside were photos. Sarah in scrubs at a rural clinic. Sarah with elderly patients. Sarah at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new mobile health unit that brought medical care to remote communities. "I grew up in a town smaller than this one," Sarah said. "My dad worked in mines until black lung destroyed his lungs. We had nothing, no way I was going to college. But your foundation gave me a chance, and now I'm giving back. This mobile clinic treats people like my dad, people who can't afford to travel to hospitals, people who would just suffer in silence otherwise." She looked at Marlowe with shining eyes. "You didn't just change my life. You changed hundreds of lives through me. That's what real wealth does. It multiplies." After she left, Marlowe went inside and found Delphine. They held each other and cried, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude that they'd been given this chance, this purpose, this proof that their lives mattered. Summer brought more visitors. Families the foundation had helped, showing up to say thank you in person. Community leaders from small towns, pitching projects that could use support. Even some of Uncle Silas's old acquaintances, people who'd known him in the 1970s and 80s, sharing stories of the paranoid but brilliant man who'd lived alone on the mountain. One old-timer, a man named Jesse, who'd been Silas's only friend, sat on the porch with Marlowe one evening. Silas wasn't crazy, Jesse said. He was just hurt. People took advantage of him when he was younger, when he first made money. So he built walls, cut people out, protected what he had by hiding it. He looked out at the mountains. "But I think he would have liked what you're doing. He didn't trust the world with his wealth, but maybe you're showing him the world was worth trusting after all." By August, the relationship with their children had evolved into something cautiously hopeful. Regular phone calls, monthly visits, the kids helping with foundation work, reviewing applications, suggesting programs. It wasn't what it had been before, the innocent love of childhood, but it was real, and it was growing. Evelyn spent a week at the cabin that summer, helping Delphine with administrative work and learning about the Foundation's mission. One night, sitting by the fire, she asked, "Grandma, do you ever regret leaving your old house, starting over up here?" Delphine thought about the question carefully. "No," she said finally, "because that house stopped being a home when it became just a building we couldn't afford. This place, this cabin, it's a home because it represents choice and dignity and purpose. We're not here because we had nowhere else to go. We're here because this is where we chose to be." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's kind of beautiful." September brought the first real test of the reconciliation. Thaddeus showed up at the cabin unannounced, his face haggard, his hands shaking. The dealership had finally failed completely. Bankruptcy. He was losing everything. His wife had left. He was broke, desperate, and clearly hoping his parents would rescue him financially. Marlowe and Delphine listened to his story, watched him break down, saw the real desperation in his eyes. The old Marlowe would have given him money immediately, unable to watch his child suffer. But this Marlowe, the one who'd learned hard lessons about enabling versus helping, made a different choice. "The Foundation can't give you money," Marlowe said firmly. "That's not what it's for. But I can give you something else. A place to stay for a while, work if you want it, and time to figure out your next steps. No handouts, no bailouts, but support while you rebuild your life the right way." Thaddeus looked like he wanted to argue, to demand, to fall back on old patterns. But something in Marlowe's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded. "Okay, thank you." He stayed in the cabin's loft for 6 weeks, worked alongside Marlowe on maintenance projects, helped with foundation paperwork, slowly learning what his father had always tried to teach him about work, dignity, earning what you have. When he left in October, he had a job lined up at a construction company and an apartment he could actually afford. He also had something more valuable, self-respect and a genuine relationship with his parents for the first time in years. Autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson. The cabin was warm and full as Marlowe and Delphine celebrated their 49th wedding anniversary with a simple dinner by the fire. They'd survived a winter that should have killed them, discovered wealth that should have destroyed them, and rebuilt relationships that seemed irretrievably broken. "Do you think Uncle Silas is watching?" Delphine asked, pouring them both coffee from the old pot they'd used that first terrifying night. "If he is," Marlowe said, I hope he sees that his life's work didn't die with him. It's just beginning. The foundation continued growing. By the end of the first year, they'd helped over 500 families, established 3 community centers, funded a rural healthcare initiative, and awarded 78 scholarships. The vault wasn't empty, not by a long shot, but it was lighter, and the weight on Marlowe and Delphine's shoulders was lighter too. They'd learned something Uncle Silas never had, that wealth wasn't meant to be guarded like a dragon's hoard. It was meant to flow like water, nourishing everything it touched, creating life where there'd been drought. One December morning, almost exactly a year after they'd arrived at the cabin, Marlowe stood at the stone door of the vault. It was open now, no longer sealed and secret. Inside, the shelves were maybe half full, millions still remaining, but millions already given away. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, from worthless and discarded to wealthy and purposeful. But the real treasure hadn't been in the vault at all. It had been in the second chances, the healed relationships, the lives transformed, the proof that they still mattered, still had value, still had something to give the world. Delphine joined him at the vault entrance. Time to close it up for winter? Marlowe shook his head. No, let's leave it open. It's not a secret anymore. It's just a storage room for a tool we're using to build something bigger than ourselves. They walked back to the cabin together, 2 people in their 70s who'd been told they were burdens and had proven they were blessings instead. That evening, all 3 of their children came for dinner, bringing spouses and grandchildren, filling the cabin with noise and life, and something that almost felt like before, but better, because it was earned rather than assumed. Sutton proposed a toast. To Mum and Dad, who taught us that being rich has nothing to do with what you have in the bank and everything to do with what you give away. Glasses clinked, people laughed, children played near the fire, and Marlowe looked at Delphine across the table, saw her smiling, saw the life in her eyes that had dimmed so much a year ago, and knew they'd made the right choice in every way that mattered. They say courage is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't show up in headlines or come with a parade. Most of the time it shows up in 2 people standing together in the cold, refusing to give up, refusing to let the world tell them they don't matter. For Marlowe and Delphine Hendricks, courage started with being thrown away like trash by their own children, and ended with them transforming not just their own lives, but hundreds of others. They didn't need fame. They didn't need credit. They just needed to know that their years on Earth had counted for something, that they'd made the world a little bit better, that they'd shown love looks like when it's real and unconditional and freely given. The cabin on the mountain became more than a refuge. It became a symbol, proof that discarded people still have value, that second chances exist at any age, that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve something bigger than yourself. And on cold winter nights, when snow fell heavy on the mountain and the fire crackled in the stone hearth, Marlowe and Delphine Hendricks would sit together wrapped in blankets, holding hands, and remember the journey that brought them here, from worthless to priceless, from forgotten to unforgettable, from victims of cruelty to vessels of grace, because sometimes the people who have nothing left to lose are the ones who find everything. And sometimes the greatest treasure isn't gold or gems or rare coins locked in a vault. Sometimes it's simply knowing that your life mattered, that you had something real to give. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to stand their ground and brave enough to give everything away. As morning sun warmed the stone walls of the mountain cabin, Marlowe and Delphine Hendricks didn't reach for their bank statements or check the vault's inventory. They reached for their foundation's application files, not for themselves, but for the hundreds of families who had been silenced, overlooked, and forgotten. The couple who once came to die in isolation had become the ones who gave others permission to live. Because for Marlowe and Delphine, and for everyone they now fought for, worth was never out of reach. It just needed someone bold enough to recognize it and generous enough to share it. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth that our value isn't measured by what we keep, but by what we give away.